A woman with terminal cancer was abandoned by her husband and son. Months later, they returned. The soft beep of medical equipment filled the sterile hospital room, a rhythmic reminder of life's fragility. Ruby lay in her bed, her once vibrant frame now frail and weakened by the relentless assault of cancer. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held a glimmer of the determination that had defined her life. As she gazed out the window at the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ruby's mind drifted through the tapestry of her life. She thought of the empire she had built, the family she had loved, and the unexpected turns that had brought her to this moment. A gentle squeeze on her hand drew her attention. Yolanda, her cousin and unexpected pillar of strength, sat beside her, a testament to the unpredictable nature of love and loyalty. Ruby managed a weak smile, a stark contrast to the successful, dynamic woman she had once been. "Yolanda," Ruby whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines, "I never thought it would end like this. So much left unsaid, so much left undone." Yolanda leaned in, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You've done more than most, Ruby. You've touched so many lives." Ruby's gaze drifted to the empty chairs on the other side of the room, a painful reminder of those absent in her final hours. Her husband, Emiliano, and son, Diego, whose love she had once taken for granted, were nowhere to be seen. As another wave of pain washed over her, Ruby closed her eyes, memories flooding her consciousness. The triumphs and failures, the laughter and tears, the love and betrayal, all of it swirled together in a bittersweet symphony of a life lived fully, if not always wisely. With each labored breath, Ruby felt the weight of her untold story, of the secrets and revelations that would soon come to light. In these final moments, as life ebbed away, she knew that her last act would set in motion events that would forever change the lives of those she loved and those who had loved her. Ruby Martinez stood at the helm of her empire, a self-made success story that had become the talk of Monterrey's business world. From her office on the top floor of a sleek skyscraper, she gazed out at the city skyline, a testament to her ambition and drive. At 45, Ruby had it all: a thriving company, a loving family, and a reputation as a formidable businesswoman. Another record quarter, she mused, reviewing the latest financial reports. We're changing lives, one innovation at a time. As she prepared for her next meeting, Ruby's phone buzzed with a message from her husband, Emiliano. "Don't forget, dinner at 7. Diego has news." Ruby smiled, thinking of her family. Emiliano, her rock for the past 20 years, had always been by her side, supporting her dreams even when they seemed impossible. And Diego, their 18-year-old son, was the light of their lives, intelligent, kind, and full of potential. As she left her office, Ruby passed by her assistant's desk. "Maria, before I forget, remind me to call Yolanda tomorrow. It's been too long since we caught up." The mention of Yolanda brought a mix of emotions. Her cousin, once as close as a sister, had drifted away over the years. Their relationship, once so strong, had become complicated, tangled in a web of unspoken words and shared history. Later that evening, as Ruby entered her luxurious home, she was greeted by the aroma of Emiliano's cooking. "There's my successful woman," he said, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Diego's in his room, probably lost in one of his projects again." Ruby made her way upstairs, knocking gently on Diego's door. "Hey, superstar, I heard you have news." Diego looked up from his computer, his eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, yeah, I got accepted into the engineering program at MIT." Ruby's heart swelled with pride. "That's incredible, honey. We always knew you were destined for great things." As they sat down for dinner, Ruby couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. This was the life she had always dreamed of: success, love, family. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension, a hint of something not quite right. Emiliano, ever perceptive, noticed Ruby's distraction. "Everything okay, my amor? You seem a million miles away." Ruby forced a smile, just thinking about work. We're on the verge of a breakthrough that could change everything. As she spoke, Ruby felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She brushed it off, attributing it to stress and long hours at the office. Little did she know, this was the first warning sign of the storm that was about to engulf her life. The next day, as Ruby prepared for a crucial presentation, she found herself unusually fatigued. The persistent cough she had developed over the past few weeks seemed to be getting worse. Still, she pushed through, her determination unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the board, "our latest project is not just about profit. It's about making a difference in people's lives. And speaking of making a difference, I'd like to take a moment to remind our viewers to hit that subscribe button on their screens. Your support helps us continue bringing you these inspiring stories of triumph and perseverance." As she finished her presentation, Ruby felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The room began to spin, and the last thing she saw before collapsing was the concerned face of her CFO rushing towards her. Hours later, Ruby awoke in a hospital bed, Emiliano clutching her hand. The doctor's words seemed to come from far away, but their impact was immediate and devastating. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm afraid we've found something concerning in your scans. We need to run more tests, but it appears to be a tumor in your lung. Given its size and location, we're looking at a potentially advanced stage of cancer." The world seemed to stop. Ruby, always in control, always the picture of health and vitality, found herself facing an enemy she couldn't negotiate with or outmaneuver. As the reality of her situation sank in, she thought of her family, her company, and all the dreams she had yet to fulfill. Emiliano, his voice thick with emotion, squeezed her hand. "We'll fight this together, mi amor. You're the strongest person I know." In that moment, as fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm her, Ruby made a decision. She would face this challenge head-on, with the same determination and courage that had defined her entire life. Little did she know, this diagnosis would set in motion a series of events that would test not only her strength, but the bonds of love, loyalty, and family. As she lay in the hospital bed, Ruby couldn't have imagined the journey that lay ahead, a journey that would reveal the true nature of those closest to her and force her to confront the complexities of her past, including her unresolved relationship with Yolanda. The coming days would bring tears and laughter, betrayal and unexpected alliances, as Ruby fought not just for her life, but for the legacy she would leave behind. And through it all, she would discover that sometimes the greatest strengths emerge from our deepest vulnerabilities. The diagnosis hit Ruby like a thunderbolt, shattering the illusion of invincibility she had built around herself. As she sat in the oncologist's office, the word stage 3 lung cancer echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of her mortality. Dr. Ramirez, a man whose compassionate eyes betrayed years of delivering such news, leaned forward. "Mrs. Martinez, I know this is overwhelming, but we have treatment options. It won't be easy, but you're not alone in this fight." Ruby nodded mechanically, her mind racing. How would she tell Emiliano and Diego? How would this affect her company, the empire she had built from the ground up? As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Ramirez added, "I suggest you tell your family as soon as possible. Their support will be crucial in the coming months." That evening, Ruby sat at the dining table, the untouched meal before her growing cold. Emiliano and Diego exchanged worried glances, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Mom, what's going on?" Diego asked, his voice tinged with fear. "You've been quiet since you got home." Ruby took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I have cancer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stage 3 lung cancer." The silence that followed was deafening. Emiliano's face drained of color, while Diego sat frozen, his fork clattering to the plate. But you've always been so healthy," Emiliano stammered, reaching for Ruby's hand. "There must be some mistake." Ruby shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm afraid not, my amor. The tests were conclusive." Diego, always the pragmatist, found his voice. "What's the treatment plan, Mom? There is a plan, right?" Ruby explained the grueling chemotherapy regimen that lay ahead, the potential for radiation, and the long road to recovery. As she spoke, she saw determination replace shock on her family's faces. "We're in this together," Emiliano declared, his voice firm. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes, we'll be by your side every step of the way." Diego nodded vigorously. "I'll defer my admission to Met. You need me here, Mom." Ruby felt a surge of love and gratitude. "No, Carino," she said, squeezing Diego's hand. "Your future is important. We'll make it work." In the days that followed, Ruby's life became a whirlwind of medical appointments, legal consultations, and difficult conversations. She appointed her trusted CFO as interim CEO, determined to keep the company stable during her treatment. The first chemotherapy session was a harsh reality check. As the drugs coursed through her veins, Ruby felt her strength ebbing away. Emiliano sat beside her, holding her hand, his presence a comfort in the sterile hospital room. "Remember when we first met?" he asked, trying to distract her from the discomfort. "You were the most beautiful, ambitious woman I'd ever seen. I knew right then you'd change my life." Ruby managed a weak smile. "We've come a long way since then, haven't we?" As the weeks passed, the toll of the treatment became evident. Ruby's once lustrous hair began to fall out, her robust frame grew gaunt, and fatigue became her constant companion. Yet she fought with every ounce of her being, drawing strength from her family's unwavering support. One evening, as Ruby rested on the couch, she overheard a hushed conversation between Emiliano and Diego. "Dad, I'm worried," Diego whispered. "Mom's so different now. It's like she's slipping away." Emiliano's voice was strained. "I know, son. But we have to be strong for her. She needs us now more than ever." And their words, though meant to be encouraging, sent a chill through Ruby. She realized that her illness wasn't just affecting her, it was transforming her entire family dynamic. As the chemotherapy progressed, Ruby found herself increasingly isolated. Business associates stopped calling, friends visited less frequently, and even Emiliano and Diego seemed to struggle with the new reality of their lives. One particularly difficult day, as Ruby battled nausea and exhaustion, she reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Yolanda," she said when her cousin answered. I need you." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with unspoken history. Then Yolanda's voice, warm and concerned, came through. "Ruby, what's wrong?" As Ruby explained her situation, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Despite their complicated past, hearing Yolanda's voice brought a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. "I'll be there tomorrow," Yolanda said without hesitation. "We're family, Ruby. No matter what's happened between us, that never changes." As she hung up the phone, Ruby felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet imagine, but in that moment, surrounded by the love of her family and with the promise of reconnecting with Yolanda, Ruby found the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Little did she know, the true test of love, loyalty, and family was only just beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Ruby's battle with cancer took an unexpected turn. The initial outpouring of support from Emiliano and Diego began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of detachment. Ruby noticed the change in small ways at first: missed appointments, forgotten medications, and an increasing reluctance to discuss her condition. One particularly difficult morning, as Ruby struggled to get out of bed, she called out for Emiliano. The house remained silent. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed his number. "Emiliano, where are you?" she asked, her voice weak and strained. "I'm at the office, Ruby." "There's an important meeting I couldn't miss," he replied, his tone businesslike and distant. Ruby felt a pang of hurt. "But my chemotherapy appointment is in an hour. You promised you'd take me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, I forgot. Can't you take a taxi?" "I really can't leave right now." As the call ended, Ruby felt tears welling up in her eyes. This wasn't the Emiliano she knew, the man who had promised to stand by her through thick and thin. She turned to Diego, hoping her son would step in, but he too seemed to be drifting away. "Mom, I can't take you today," Diego said, avoiding eye contact. "I have a study group, and it's really important for my grades." Ruby nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "It's okay, Mijo, I understand." As she sat alone in the cold hospital room, waiting for her treatment to begin, Ruby felt a profound sense of loneliness wash over her. The sterile walls and beeping machines seemed to mock the warmth and love she had once taken for granted. It was in this moment of despair that an unexpected figure appeared in the doorway. Yolanda, her long-estranged cousin, stood there with a look of determination and compassion. "Ruby," Yolanda said softly, "I'm here." The sight of her cousin brought a flood of emotions to Ruby. Years of unresolved tension and complicated history hung between them, but in that moment, none of it mattered. "Yolanda," Ruby whispered, her voice breaking. "You came." Yolanda moved swiftly to Ruby's side, taking her hand. "Of course I came. I'm sorry it took me so long." As the nurses prepared Ruby for her treatment, Yolanda remained by her side, offering words of encouragement and gentle support. For the first time in weeks, Ruby felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, Yolanda became a constant presence in Ruby's life. She took charge of medication schedules, prepared nourishing meals, and provided the emotional support that Ruby so desperately needed. One evening, as they sat together in Ruby's living room, Yolanda broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "Ruby, where are Emiliano and Diego? I've barely seen them since I arrived." Ruby's face fell, the pain of her family's withdrawal evident in her eyes. They've been busy. Emiliano with work, Diego with school. It's been hard for them seeing me like this. Yolanda's expression hardened. "That's no excuse, Ruby. You need them now more than ever." As if on cue, the front door opened and Emiliano walked in. He stopped short at the sight of Yolanda, surprise and something else, guilt perhaps, flashing across his face. "Yolanda," he said, his voice tight, "I didn't know you were here." Yolanda stood, her posture defensive. "I've been here for days, Emiliano. Where have you been?" The tension in the room was palpable. Ruby watched as her husband and cousin faced off, years of unspoken history crackling between them. "I've been working," Emiliano said defensively. "Someone has to keep things going while Ruby is indisposed." The word choice hit Ruby like a physical blow. Indisposed, as if her fight for life was a mere inconvenience. "Indisposed," Yolanda repeated, her voice rising. "She's fighting for her life, Emiliano. She needs her husband, her family." Emiliano's face flushed with anger. "You have no right to judge me, Yolanda. You weren't here for years, and now suddenly you're the expert on what Ruby needs." As the argument escalated, Ruby felt a surge of strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Stop it," she shouted, silencing both Emiliano and Yolanda. "This isn't helping anyone." The room fell quiet, both parties looking ashamed. Ruby took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Emiliano, I need you. I need my husband, not just someone who pays the bills. And Yolanda, thank you for being here, but this is still my family. We need to work this out together." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Emiliano admitted his fear of losing Ruby, how watching her suffer had made him feel helpless and afraid. Yolanda spoke of her regret for staying away so long and her determination to make amends. As the night wore on, a fragile peace settled over the house, but Ruby knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. In the weeks that followed, Yolanda's presence became a source of both comfort and tension. While Ruby relied increasingly on her cousin's support, Emiliano and Diego seemed to withdraw further. One afternoon, as Ruby rested after a particularly grueling treatment session, she overheard a heated conversation between Emiliano and Yolanda in the kitchen. "You can't just waltz back into her life and take over," Emiliano hissed. "We were doing fine before you showed up." Yolanda's reply was sharp. "Fine? Is that what you call abandoning her when she needs you most?" Ruby closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. This was not the united front she had hoped for. As days turned into weeks, Ruby found herself leaning more and more on Yolanda. Her cousin's unwavering support and practical help became a lifeline. Yet with each passing day, the distance between Ruby and her immediate family seemed to grow. Emiliano spent longer hours at the office, often returning home long after Ruby had gone to bed. Diego, once so eager to spend time with his mother, now seemed to find excuses to be anywhere but home. It was during this time that Ruby made a decision that would alter the course of their lives. Sitting in her study, surrounded by the trappings of her once busy life, she began to draft a new will. As her pen moved across the paper, Ruby felt a mix of sadness and resolve. The choices she was making would undoubtedly cause pain, but she believed they were necessary. In Yolanda, she had found the support and love she craved. In Emiliano and Diego's absence, she had found clarity. Little did Ruby know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundations of love, loyalty, and family. The turning point had arrived, and there would be no going back. The relentless march of time brought no respite for Ruby as she battled against the insidious disease ravaging her body. Each day seemed to blend into the next, a hazy mixture of pain, fatigue, and an ever-present sense of isolation that gnawed at her spirit. Mornings were the hardest. Ruby would wake, her body aching from the effects of the chemotherapy, to find the house eerily quiet. Emiliano's side of the bed was often cold and untouched, a stark reminder of the growing distance between them. She would lie there, staring at the ceiling, gathering the strength to face another day of struggle. As she shuffled to the bathroom, Ruby caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was a far cry from the vibrant, successful businesswoman she had once been. Her once lustrous hair had thinned to wisps, her skin sallow and drawn. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to nights spent in restless, pain-filled slumber. "Who are you?" she whispered to her reflection, barely recognizing herself. The daily routine of medications was a cruel reminder of her new reality. Pills to combat nausea, pills to boost her weakened immune system, pills to manage the constant pain. Ruby lined them up on the kitchen counter, a colorful array that represented her tenuous grip on life. But as she swallowed each bitter pill, Ruby couldn't help but think of how her life had changed. The boardroom had been replaced by the hospital room, business strategies by treatment plans. The silence of the house was broken only by the occasional ping of her phone, usually a message from Yolanda checking in, rarely from Emiliano or Diego. The loneliness was perhaps the most difficult aspect to bear. Ruby, once surrounded by a bustling family and a network of colleagues and friends, now found herself increasingly isolated. Phone calls from business associates dwindled, their discomfort with her illness palpable even through the phone lines. Friends visited less frequently, unsure of how to act around her in her weakened state. Even when Emiliano or Diego were home, there was a palpable tension in the air. Conversations were stilted, focusing on mundane topics while carefully avoiding any mention of her condition. Ruby longed for the easy companionship they had once shared, the laughter and warmth that had filled their home. One particularly difficult evening, as Ruby sat alone in the living room, she found herself leafing through a family photo album. Images of happier times stared back at her vacations, birthdays, simple moments of joy captured on film. A photo of her and Emiliano on their wedding day caught her eye, their faces radiant with love and hope for the future. "Where did we lose our way?" Ruby murmured, tracing Emiliano's face in the photograph. The man in the picture, full of love and promise, seemed a far cry from the distant, almost stranger-like husband she now lived with. As she turned the pages, Ruby came across a series of photos from Diego's childhood. Her son's toothless grin beamed up at her, his small hand clutched in hers as they walked through a park. The memory of that day washed over her, the warmth of the sun, Diego's excited chatter, the simple joy of being together. Tears began to fall, dotting the plastic covers of the album. Ruby's shoulders shook with silent sobs as the weight of her loneliness crashed over her. She longed to feel Diego's hand in hers again, to see his smile directed at her without the shadow of fear and discomfort that now clouded his eyes when he looked at her. In moments like these, Ruby felt the full force of her isolation. The house, once a home filled with love and laughter, now felt more like a mausoleum, a place where the living went through the motions while waiting for the inevitable end. The silence was broken by the buzz of her phone. Ruby reached for it, hope flaring briefly in her chest. Perhaps it was Emiliano calling to say he was coming home early, or Diego asking if she needed anything. Instead, it was a message from Dr. Ramirez reminding her of her upcoming appointment. Ruby sighed, placing the phone back on the table. Even her medical team seemed to communicate more with her than her own family these days. The irony was not lost on her. Strangers in white coats now knew more about her daily struggles than the people she had loved and cared for all her life. As night fell, Ruby prepared for another solitary evening. She moved slowly through the house, turning on lamps to chase away the encroaching darkness. The pool of light seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the rooms, the absence of the family life that had once filled these spaces. Settling into her favorite armchair, Ruby picked up a book, more out of habit than any real desire to read. The words swam before her eyes, failing to capture her attention. Instead, her mind wandered, dwelling on the life she had lost and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The sound of a key in the lock startled her from her reverie. Emiliano entered, his eyes meeting hers briefly before skittering away. "You're still up," he said, his tone a mixture of surprise and something else, guilt, perhaps. "I couldn't sleep," Ruby replied, watching as he moved awkwardly around the room, clearly unsure of how to act around her. "How was your day?" Emiliano shrugged, busying himself with taking off his coat. "Busy, lots of meetings. You know how it is." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things they no longer said to each other. Ruby longed to bridge the gap between them, to find her way back to the man she had married. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by fear and a growing sense of resignation. As Emiliano muttered something about being tired and headed upstairs, Ruby felt a fresh wave of loneliness wash over her. She was surrounded by the trappings of her life, the home she had made, the family she had raised, and yet she had never felt more alone. In the quiet of the night, as the house settled around her, Ruby faced the harsh reality of her situation. The cancer was not just attacking her body, it was eroding the very foundations of her life, leaving her isolated and adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. As Ruby's world seemed to shrink, confined by illness and loneliness, Yolanda's presence grew, filling the void left by Emiliano and Diego's withdrawal. What had started as occasional visits and phone calls quickly evolved into a near-constant presence, with Yolanda becoming Ruby's primary caregiver and emotional support. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Years of estrangement had left their mark, and there were moments of awkwardness as the two women navigated their renewed relationship. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, a new rhythm emerged, one built on shared experiences and a deepening bond. Yolanda's days now revolved around Ruby's needs. She arrived early each morning, often before the sun had fully risen, to help Ruby start her day. The routine they developed became a lifeline for Ruby, a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. "Good morning, Sunshine," Yolanda would call out cheerfully as she entered the house, her arms often laden with groceries or fresh flowers to brighten Ruby's day. Her energy and positivity were infectious, providing a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that had pervaded the house. Yolanda took charge of Ruby's medical regimen, meticulously organizing pills and tracking appointment schedules. She accompanied Ruby to her treatments, holding her hand through the worst of the side effects and providing a steady stream of encouragement. "You're doing great, Ruby," she would say, her voice firm and reassuring. "You're so much stronger than you know." But Yolanda's care extended far beyond the practical aspects of Ruby's illness. She seemed to instinctively understand Ruby's need for normalcy, for moments that weren't defined by her cancer. She would regale Ruby with funny stories from her day, gossip about neighbors, or simply sit in companionable silence, offering the gift of her presence. One afternoon, as Ruby rested on the couch after a particularly grueling treatment session, Yolanda bustled into the room, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I've got a surprise for you," she announced, producing a small bag from behind her back. Ruby raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What's this?" Yolanda grinned, pulling out a selection of nail polishes and face masks. "We're having a spa day right here in your living room." Doctor's orders. For the next few hours, the two women laughed and chatted as they painted each other's nails and applied face masks. It was a slice of normalcy, a reminder of the simple pleasures that Ruby had almost forgotten in the face of her illness. As Yolanda carefully applied a coat of Ruby's favorite red polish to her toenails, Ruby felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this, for being here." Yolanda looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Ruby. We're family." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. It was a stark reminder of the absence of Emiliano and Diego, but also a testament to the unexpected bond that had formed between the two women. Yolanda's increasing involvement in Ruby's life didn't come without cost. Her own life was put on hold as she dedicated herself to Ruby's care. She scaled back her work hours, relying on savings to make ends meet. Her social life dwindled, friends and potential romantic interests taking a backseat to her commitment to Ruby. One evening, as Yolanda was preparing to leave after a long day, Ruby broached the subject. "Yolanda, I can't help but notice. You're here all the time. What about your own life, your work, your friends?" Yolanda paused in the act of putting on her coat, her expression softening. "Ruby, right now this is my life. You're my priority. But surely you must have other commitments, other people who need you." Ruby pressed, guilt gnawing at her. Yolanda sat down next to Ruby, taking her hand. "Listen to me. Years ago, when I was going through my divorce, you were there for me. You helped me get back on my feet, gave me a job when no one else would. Now it's my turn to be there for you." Tears welled up in Ruby's eyes at the memory. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that younger version of herself who had reached out to help her struggling cousin. "I never expected you to pay me back," she whispered. "This isn't about paying you back," Yolanda said firmly. "This is about family, about love. Yes, I've made sacrifices, but they're sacrifices I choose to make. You're worth it, Ruby." The depth of Yolanda's commitment was thrown into sharp relief one afternoon when Ruby overheard a phone conversation between Yolanda and her son Miguel. "I know, Mijo. I'm sorry I missed your game," Yolanda was saying, her voice low. "Tia, Ruby had a bad reaction to her treatment. I couldn't leave her." "Yes, I know I promised, but sometimes we have to put others first. I'll make it up to you, I promise." As Yolanda ended the call, Ruby felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. She was acutely aware of the toll her illness was taking not just on her, but on those around her. Yolanda's sacrifices, made willingly and without complaint, were a stark contrast to the withdrawal of her own immediate family. Yolanda, Ruby called out softly as her cousin re-entered the room. "I heard. I'm so sorry you missed Miguel's game because of me." Yolanda's face softened. "Oh, Ruby, don't worry about that. Miguel understands. He knows how important you are to me." "But your life shouldn't stop because of me," Ruby protested. "Your children need you too." Yolanda sat down next to Ruby, taking her hand. "My children are older now, Ruby. They understand that sometimes we have to make hard choices. Right now you need me more. And that's okay." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Emiliano walked in, stopping short at the sight of the two women on the couch. His eyes flickered between them, a mixture of emotions crossing his face too quickly to decipher. "Yolanda," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I didn't realize you were still here." "I was just leaving," Yolanda replied, standing up. She squeezed Ruby's hand one last time before gathering her things. As she passed Emiliano on her way out, she paused. She had a rough day today. She could use some company. Emiliano nodded stiffly, watching as Yolanda left. The silence that followed her departure was heavy, filled with unspoken words and growing tension. As the days passed, Yolanda's presence in Ruby's life continued to grow, filling the void left by Emiliano and Diego's increasing absence. She became not just a caregiver, but a confidante, a source of strength and comfort in Ruby's darkest moments. One particularly difficult night, as Ruby battled with pain and nausea, it was Yolanda who sat by her bedside, wiping her brow and murmuring words of comfort. In the pale light of dawn, as the worst of the symptoms finally subsided, Ruby looked at her cousin with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered. Yolanda smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Ruby's forehead. "You'll never have to find out. I'm here, Ruby, always." In that moment, Ruby felt a shift in her heart. The bond between her and Yolanda, forged in the crucible of illness and hardship, had become something profound and unbreakable. It was a revelation that would shape the decisions to come, decisions that would alter the course of all their lives. As Ruby's battle with cancer intensified, she found herself increasingly unable to focus on the business empire she had built. The company that had once been her pride and joy, the result of years of hard work and dedication, now felt like a distant memory. Sitting in her home office one afternoon, surrounded by financial reports and urgent emails, Ruby came to a difficult realization. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to herself, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words felt like a surrender, but also a relief. For weeks, Ruby had been receiving calls from her CFO, James, about pressing matters that required her attention. Major decisions needed to be made, contracts needed to be signed, and the board was growing restless. But Ruby found herself unable to summon the energy or focus needed to run a multinational corporation. With a heavy heart, she picked up the phone and dialed James's number. "James," she said when he answered, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "I think it's time we discuss selling the company." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure about this, Ruby? The company is your life's work." Ruby closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. "It was my life's work, James, but now I need to focus on my actual life, on the time I have left." Over the next few days, Ruby met with her legal team and financial advisors to discuss the process of selling the company. As word spread of her intention to sell, offers began pouring in. The business world was abuzz with speculation about who would acquire Ruby Martinez's empire. As she sifted through the offers, Ruby found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She remembered the early days of the company, working late nights in a tiny office, fueled by nothing but determination and instant coffee. She thought of the risks she had taken, the setbacks she had overcome, and the triumphs she had celebrated. One evening, as she sat in her living room reviewing the latest acquisition offer, Yolanda found her lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts," Yolanda asked, settling down next to her. Ruby smiled wryly. "I was just thinking about how much of my life I poured into this company, and now I'm letting it go." Yolanda took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not letting it go, Ruby. You're ensuring its future, and more importantly, you're prioritizing yourself." Ruby nodded, grateful for Yolanda's understanding. It feels like the end of an era, like I'm saying goodbye to a part of myself." "It's not goodbye," Yolanda said firmly. "It's a new chapter. The company will continue carrying your vision forward. And you get to focus on what really matters now." As the sale process progressed, Ruby found herself becoming more at peace with her decision. She took care to choose a buyer who shared her values and vision for the company's future. After weeks of negotiations and due diligence, a deal was finally struck. The day Ruby signed the final papers, she felt a mix of emotions. There was sadness, yes, but also a sense of relief and even excitement for what the future might hold. As she put pen to paper, officially transferring ownership of her life's work, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Walking out of the lawyer's office, Ruby took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. For the first time in months, she felt truly free. Free from the responsibilities that had weighed her down, free to focus on her health and the people she loved. As she got into her car, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emiliano, heard the news about the company. "Are you okay? We should talk." Ruby stared at the message, a frown creasing her brow. It was the first time in weeks that Emiliano had reached out to her about anything substantial. She couldn't help but wonder about the timing of his sudden interest. Little did she know, this message would mark the beginning of a new and challenging chapter in her journey. The day after Ruby finalized the sale of her company, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of her home. Emiliano had been increasingly absent over the past months, was suddenly present at breakfast, his manner solicitous and attentive. "How are you feeling today, my amor?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The touch, once familiar and comforting, now felt strange and out of place. Ruby eyed him warily, unsure how to respond to this sudden change. "I'm managing," she said finally, "the same as yesterday and the day before." Emiliano nodded, his expression a mask of concern. "I've been thinking, Ruby, I haven't been as present as I should have been. I want to change that. Let me take care of you." Before Ruby could respond, Diego entered the kitchen, his usual morning rush replaced by a deliberate calm. He approached Ruby, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Morning, Mom. Is there anything you need today? I could skip my study group if you want company." Ruby felt a surge of emotion, hope mingled with suspicion. This was the son she remembered, the caring boy who had seemed lost to her these past months. But the timing, it was too convenient to ignore. As the days passed, Emiliano and Diego's renewed attention continued. They were constantly at Ruby's side, offering help, asking about her health, reminiscing about old times. It was as if the months of neglect had never happened. One afternoon, as Ruby rested on the patio, Emiliano joined her, a folder in his hand. "Ruby," he began, his tone careful, "I've been thinking about our future. With the sale of the company, we need to consider how to manage our assets." Ruby felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm sun. "Our assets," she repeated, her voice level. Emiliano nodded, opening the folder to reveal financial documents. "I've been talking to some advisors. They suggest we should consider some investments, maybe set up a trust. For Diego's future, you know." As Emiliano continued to talk about financial planning and estate management, Ruby felt a growing sense of disillusionment. The caring husband of the past few days was replaced by a man focused solely on money. Later that evening, Ruby overheard a conversation between Emiliano and Diego that confirmed her worst suspicions. "But Dad," Diego was saying, his voice low but urgent, Isn't this wrong? Using Mom's condition to get control of her money. Emiliano's reply was sharp. We're not using anything, Diego. We're her family. We have a right to be involved in these decisions. Your mother isn't thinking clearly right now. It's up to us to secure our future. Ruby felt her heart break all over again. The renewed attention, the sudden care and concern, it had all been a facade, a ploy to gain access to her wealth. As she lay in bed that night, tears silently streaming down her face, Ruby made a decision. She would play along for now, let Emiliano and Diego think their plan was working, but in secret she would take steps to protect herself and her assets. The next morning, Ruby called her lawyer. I need to make some changes to my will, she said, her voice steady and determined. And I need to ensure that certain people cannot access my assets without my explicit consent. As she hung up the phone, Ruby felt a mix of sadness and resolve. The family she had loved and trusted had revealed their true colors, but she was Ruby Martinez, a woman who had built an empire from nothing. She would not let herself be taken advantage of, not even by those she had once held dearest. With Yolanda's unwavering support and her own inner strength, Ruby prepared to face this new betrayal head-on. The battle ahead would not be against cancer, but against greed and deception. And Ruby was determined to win. As the autumn leaves began to fall, painting the world outside in hues of gold and crimson, Ruby felt a shift within herself. The constant battle against cancer had taken its toll, and she sensed that her time was drawing to a close. Yet, rather than fear, she felt a strange sense of peace washing over her. One crisp morning, as Yolanda helped her to the sun-drenched patio, Ruby gazed out at the garden she had lovingly tended for years. The roses were fading, their petals scattered on the ground, but there was beauty even in their decline. It's funny, Ruby mused, her voice soft. I always thought I'd be afraid at the end, but I'm not. I'm just tired. Yolanda squeezed her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. You fought so hard, Ruby. You're the bravest person I know. Ruby smiled, a wistful expression crossing her face. I've been thinking a lot about my life, Yolanda. About the choices I've made, the people I've loved. As the days passed, Ruby found herself increasingly reflective. She thought about her journey from a young, ambitious woman to a successful businesswoman, and now to this final chapter of her life. She remembered the thrill of closing her first big deal, the pride she felt when her company went public, the joy of holding Diego for the first time. But it wasn't just the big moments that occupied her thoughts. She found herself dwelling on the small, everyday moments that had made up the tapestry of her life. The quiet mornings with Emiliano before the world intruded, the sound of Diego's laughter echoing through the house, the satisfaction of a well-cooked meal shared with friends. One afternoon, as she sat in her favorite armchair, a photo album open on her lap, Ruby called Yolanda over. Look at this, she said, pointing to a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Ruby and Yolanda, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. Do you remember this day? Yolanda leaned in, a smile spreading across her face. How could I forget? It was the day you convinced me to quit my dead-end job and go back to school. You said I was destined for greater things. Ruby nodded, her eyes misting over. You were. You are. Yolanda, I want you to know, these past months having you here, it's reminded me of what truly matters in life. Not money, not success, but love. Connection. As Ruby's physical strength waned, her mental clarity seemed to sharpen. She began to see her life with a new perspective, understanding the true value of the relationships she had forged and the impact she had made on others. She thought about Emiliano and Diego, their recent behavior casting a shadow over years of shared love and memories. Despite the pain of their betrayal, Ruby found that she couldn't summon anger. Instead, she felt a profound sadness for the love that had been lost, the trust that had been broken. "I wish things could have been different," she confided in Yolanda one evening. "I wish I could have seen the cracks before they became chasms. Maybe if I had paid more attention, been less focused on my work." Yolanda shook her head firmly. "Ruby, don't do this to yourself. You loved them with everything you had. Their choices are not your fault." As her energy dwindled, Ruby began to put her affairs in order. She spent hours with her lawyer, ensuring that her final wishes would be respected. She wrote letters to old friends and colleagues, expressing gratitude for their roles in her life. And she began to work on a final letter, one that would only be read after she was gone. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep eluded her, Ruby would often find herself thinking about the legacy she was leaving behind. Not just the company she had built, but the lives she had touched, the changes she had made in the world. "I hope I've done enough," she whispered into the darkness one night. "I hope I've made a difference." As if in answer to her unspoken fears, the next day brought an unexpected visitor. Maria, her former assistant, arrived with a bundle of letters in her arms. "These came to the office for you," Ruby Maria explained, her eyes brimming with emotion. "They're from employees, clients, even competitors. All of them wanted to express their gratitude, to tell you how much you've impacted their lives." Ruby spent hours reading through the letters, tears flowing freely as she absorbed the words of appreciation and love. Stories of how she had inspired young women to pursue their dreams, how her ethical business practices had set a new standard in the industry, how her mentorship had changed lives. It was a powerful reminder that a life well lived ripples outward, touching countless others in ways we may never fully understand. As Ruby felt her time growing shorter, she found herself filled with a sense of completion. There was sadness, yes, for the things she would miss: Diego's future accomplishments, the changing seasons, the simple pleasure of a new day. But there was also a profound gratitude for the life she had lived, the love she had experienced, the difference she had made. In her final days, Ruby found moments of unexpected joy. The taste of her favorite ice cream that Yolanda snuck into the hospital. The warmth of sunlight on her face during brief outdoor respites. The sound of loved ones' voices, even if some were now tinged with complexities she couldn't fully resolve. And through it all, Ruby held on to the knowledge that she had lived fully, loved deeply, and left her mark on the world. As she drifted into what would be her final sleep, a small smile played on her lips. She was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the Martinez household had been building for weeks, a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon when Emiliano entered Ruby's room unannounced, a stack of papers in his hand. "Ruby, my amor," he began, his tone overly solicitous. "I've been speaking with our financial advisor. He thinks it's crucial we make some decisions about our estate planning. For Diego's future, you understand." Ruby, propped up in bed with Yolanda by her side, felt a surge of anger she didn't know she still had the energy for. "Our estate planning, Emiliano? Or your plans for my money?" Emiliano's facade of concern slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of frustration. "Ruby, be reasonable. We're talking about our family's security here." Before Ruby could respond, Yolanda stood up, placing herself between Ruby and Emiliano. "I think you should leave, Emiliano. Ruby needs to rest." Emiliano's face darkened. "You don't get to make that decision, Yolanda. This is between me and my wife." "Your wife?" Yolanda scoffed, her voice rising. "Where was this concern for your wife when she was going through chemo alone? Where were you when she needed you most?" The commotion drew Diego to the room. He stood in the doorway, his young face etched with conflicting emotions. "What's going on? Why is everyone yelling?" Ruby, summoning strength she didn't know she had, spoke up. "Your father thinks now is a good time to discuss how to spend my money, Diego. Apparently my illness is the perfect opportunity to plan for his future." Diego's eyes widened, darting between his parents. "Dad, you said we were here to support Mom, not to." Enough, Emiliano roared, his calm demeanor completely shattered. I have put up with this circus for too long. Ruby, you need to face facts. You're dying. Someone needs to think about what happens next, about securing our family's future. A heavy silence fell over the room. Ruby's face, pale from illness, flushed with a mixture of anger and hurt. Our family's future, Emiliano, or your future? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like there's much of a family left to secure. Yolanda, her voice shaking with barely contained rage, turned to Emiliano. How dare you? How dare you come in here, to the sickbed of the woman you promised to love and cherish, and talk about her death as if it's a business transaction? Emiliano's face contorted with anger. You have no right to judge me, Yolanda. You who swooped in at the last minute to play the hero. Where were you all these years? You're not family. You're an outsider, and you need to remember your place. My place, Yolanda retorted, her voice rising. My place has been right here by Ruby's side, while you've been God knows where, doing God knows what. I've been here holding her hand through chemo, cleaning up when she's been sick, listening to her fears in the middle of the night. Where were you? Emiliano, where was her husband when she needed him most? Diego, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror, finally found his voice. Stop it. All of you, just stop, he turned to his father, tears in his eyes. Dad, is this true? Did we really abandon Mom when she needed us? Emiliano's anger seemed to deflate slightly in the face of his son's distress. Diego, you don't understand. Sometimes in difficult situations we have to think practically. Practically, Ruby interrupted, her voice quiet but steely. Is that what you call it, Emiliano? Abandoning your sick wife is practical? Trying to get your hands on my money before I'm even gone is practical. Emiliano turned to Ruby, his face a mixture of frustration and something that might have been shame. Ruby, you're not thinking clearly. The cancer, the medications, they're affecting your judgment. I'm just trying to do what's best for our family. No, Emiliano, Ruby said, her voice gaining strength. For once I'm seeing things very clearly. I see a man I once loved, a man I thought I knew, revealing his true colors, and I see a woman. She gestured to Yolanda, who has shown me more love and support in these past months than you have in years. Diego, tears now flowing freely, approached his mother's bed. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Ruby reached out to take her son's hand. Oh, Diego, my sweet boy, I know you didn't fully understand, but you're old enough now to make your own choices, to decide what kind of man you want to be. Emiliano, sensing he was losing control of the situation, made one last attempt. Ruby, please. Let's discuss this rationally. We can bring in a mediator, someone to help us make these decisions together. But Ruby had had enough. With a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself, she sat up straighter in bed. There's nothing to discuss, Emiliano. My mind is made up. I've already spoken to my lawyers. My will is ironclad. You won't be getting your hands on my money, not now, not ever. The color drained from Emiliano's face. You can't do that. I'm your husband. I have rights. Rights, Yolanda scoffed. You gave up those rights when you abandoned her, when you chose your own comfort over your wedding vows. As the argument escalated, Ruby felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had imagined many scenarios for how her life might end, but this bitter confrontation had never been among them. She closed her eyes, tuning out the raised voices around her, and thought about the letter she had written, the one that would be read after she was gone. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of her fractured family, Ruby made a final decision. She would face her last days with dignity, surrounded by those who truly loved her. And she would leave behind a legacy that would force Emiliano, Diego, and even Yolanda to confront some hard truths. As the shouting match continued, Ruby opened her eyes and spoke, her quiet voice somehow cutting through the noise. Enough. All of you, please leave. I need to rest. The room fell silent. One by one they filed out Emiliano, his face a mask of anger and frustration, Diego, looking lost and conflicted, and finally Yolanda, who squeezed Ruby's hand before reluctantly leaving her side. Alone at last, Ruby let out a long, shaky breath. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. But it had also strengthened her resolve. She reached for the bedside table, where a sealed envelope lay waiting. Inside was the letter that would change everything, her final message to those she loved and those who had disappointed her. As she held the envelope, Ruby felt a sense of peace wash over her. Whatever happened next, she had said her piece, she had stood her ground, and in the end she would have the last word. In the quiet of her room, with the echoes of the recent confrontation still lingering in the air, Ruby reached for a pen and paper. Her hand trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. This letter would be her final testament, her last opportunity to speak her truth and shape the future she would leave behind. To my family, she began, her pen scratching softly against the paper. If you're reading this, then I have left this world. But before I go, there are things that need to be said, truths that must be faced. Ruby paused, gathering her thoughts. How does one summarize a lifetime of love, disappointment, and hard-earned wisdom in a single letter? She took a deep breath and continued writing. Emiliano, my husband, the father of my child. We shared a love once that I thought would withstand any storm, but in my darkest hour, when I needed you most, you chose to turn away. Your recent actions have shown me that the man I married is gone, replaced by someone I barely recognize. I want you to know that I forgive you, not for your sake, but for my own peace. I release you from any obligation you might feel towards me. But remember, this true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the love we give and receive. Tears welled up in Ruby's eyes as she moved on to address her son. Diego, my beautiful boy, your absence during my illness cut deeper than you could ever know. But you are young, and I believe there is still time for you to learn and grow. I hope that in the years to come, you will reflect on these times and use them as a lesson in compassion and loyalty. Remember, my son, that our choices define us. Choose wisely, choose kindly. Ruby paused, her hand cramping slightly. She flexed her fingers before continuing, her thoughts turning to the unexpected pillar of strength in her life. Yolanda, my dear cousin, words cannot express my gratitude for your unwavering support during these difficult months. You came back into my life when I needed you most, and you stayed even when things were at their darkest. Your kindness, your strength, and your love have been my lifeline. In you, I have rediscovered the true meaning of family. As Ruby wrote, she felt a sense of liberation. Every word on the page was a weight lifting from her shoulders, every sentence a step towards peace. Now, to address the matter that has caused so much strife in my final days, my estate. I've lived a fortunate life, built a successful business, and accumulated more wealth than I ever dreamed possible. But I've also learned that money, while useful, cannot buy the things that truly matter. Ruby's pen moved faster now, driven by a clarity of purpose. Therefore, I have made the following decisions regarding my estate. To Emiliano, I leave a sum of money that will ensure he lives comfortably, but not excessively. This is not out of spite, but out of a hope that he will rediscover the values that once defined him. To Diego, I establish a trust fund for his education and future endeavors. However, this fund comes with conditions. He must complete his education and demonstrate a commitment to community service before he can access the full amount. I do this not to control you, my son, but to encourage you to grow into the man I know you can be. The bulk of my estate, including my shares in the company, I leave to Yolanda. Not only has she proven herself to be a true friend and family member, but I believe she will use these resources wisely and for the betterment of others. Lastly, I am establishing a foundation in my name. This foundation will focus on supporting women in business, funding cancer research, and providing assistance to families dealing with terminal illnesses. It is my hope that through this foundation, my life's work can continue to make a positive impact on the world." Ruby paused, her hand aching but her heart full. She was nearing the end now, both of the letter and her journey. "To all of you, I leave these final thoughts. Life is precious and unpredictable. Don't waste it on petty grievances or the pursuit of wealth at the expense of relationships. Love deeply, forgive freely, and always strive to leave the world a little better than you found it. Remember me not as I was in these final days, but as the woman who loved you, who believed in you, and who hoped for your happiness above all else. With all my love, Ruby." As Ruby signed her name, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, sealing it with a quiet finality. She then called for her lawyer, entrusting him with this most important document. "Make sure this is read to them all together," she instructed, her voice weak but determined. "After I'm gone." The lawyer nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the responsibility he was being given. With her final wishes committed to paper, Ruby settled back against her pillows. She had said what needed to be said, made the decisions that needed to be made. Now she could face whatever came next with a clear conscience and an open heart. As the sun began to set outside her window, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Ruby closed her eyes. She thought of the life she had lived, the loves she had known, the legacy she would leave behind. And in that moment, despite the pain and the sadness, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future she had helped shape, even if she wouldn't be there to see it. Ruby drifted off to sleep, a small smile playing on her lips. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was ready. She had lived, she had loved, and in the end she had spoken her truth. And that, she realized, was all anyone could really ask for. The autumn sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon when Ruby drew her last breath. The room was quiet, save for the gentle hum of medical equipment and the soft sobs of Yolanda, who had kept a tireless vigil at her cousin's bedside. "She's gone," Yolanda whispered, her voice breaking. She gently squeezed Ruby's hand, still warm but now lifeless. "Oh, Ruby." As if sensing the profound shift in the room, a nurse entered quietly. With practiced compassion, she confirmed what Yolanda already knew and began the solemn process that follows a patient's passing. Yolanda sat there, lost in a fog of grief, barely registering the nurse's gentle words of condolence. Her mind raced through memories of the past months, the laughter, the tears, the quiet moments of connection that had bound her to Ruby more tightly than she ever thought possible. "I should call Emiliano and Diego," Yolanda murmured, more to herself than to the nurse. But the thought of facing them, of sharing this moment with those who had caused Ruby so much pain in her final days, felt almost unbearable. As Yolanda reached for her phone, she paused, looking directly at you, the viewer. "You know, it's in moments like these that we realize how precious life is, how every second we have with our loved ones is a gift. Don't wait until it's too late to show them how much you care." With a deep breath, Yolanda dialed Emiliano's number. The conversation was brief, clinical almost. Emiliano's voice betrayed little emotion as he acknowledged the news and said he would inform Diego. As the morning wore on, the room that had been Ruby's world for so long began to fill with people, doctors offering condolences, nurses completing paperwork, and finally, Emiliano and Diego arriving with shell-shocked expressions. Diego's face was streaked with tears as he approached the bed where his mother lay. "Mom," he whispered, reaching out to touch her hand before quickly withdrawing, as if burned by the reality of her absence. Emiliano stood at the foot of the bed, his face an unreadable mask. "So it's done then," he said, his voice flat. Yolanda felt a surge of anger at his coldness. "She's not a business deal that's done, Emiliano. She was your wife. Show some respect." Before Emiliano could retort, A new figure entered the room, Mr. Alvarez, Ruby's lawyer. His presence seemed to charge the air with a new tension. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss," Mr. Alvarez began, his tone professional yet sympathetic. "Mrs. Martinez left explicit instructions for me to read her final letter to you all together, as soon as possible after her passing." Emiliano's eyebrows shot up. "A letter? What letter?" Mr. Alvarez produced an envelope from his briefcase. "Mrs. Martinez's final wishes and thoughts are contained here. She was most insistent that I read it to all of you together." As Mr. Alvarez prepared to read, Yolanda once again seemed to address you, the viewer, directly. "Sometimes the most important things are left unsaid until it's almost too late. Don't let that happen to you. Tell your loved ones how you feel while you still can." The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read Ruby's letter. As her words filled the room, each person reacted in their own way. Diego's sobs grew louder, his body shaking with grief and remorse. Emiliano's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, anger, shame, and finally, a deep sadness. Yolanda listened with tears streaming down her face, feeling both honored by Ruby's words and overwhelmed by the responsibility being placed upon her. As Mr. Alvarez finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the room. The weight of Ruby's final wishes seemed to press down on all of them. Diego was the first to speak, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Mum. I'm so sorry." He turned to Yolanda, his eyes pleading. "I didn't understand. I should have been here. I should have." Yolanda moved to embrace him, her own grief momentarily set aside to comfort the young man. "Shh. It's okay, Diego. Your mum loved you. She understood." Emiliano, however, was not so easily consoled. His face had hardened into a mask of anger and disbelief. "This can't be legal," he spat. "She wasn't in her right mind. I'll contest this." Mr. Alvarez shook his head firmly. "I assure you, Mr. Martinez, everything is in order. Mrs. Martinez was of sound mind when she made these decisions. Any attempt to contest the will would be futile and frankly would go against your late wife's explicit wishes." As the reality of the situation sank in, Emiliano seemed to deflate. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a look of utter defeat. Without another word, he turned and left the room. In the wake of his departure, Yolanda, Diego, and Mr. Alvarez stood in awkward silence. The finality of Ruby's passing, coupled with the bombshell of her final wishes, left them all reeling. Diego, still clinging to Yolanda, looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "What happens now?" he asked, sounding young and lost. Yolanda sighed, feeling the weight of her new responsibilities settling on her shoulders. "Now, we honor your mother's wishes, we grieve, we remember, and we try to live up to the faith she placed in us." As the day wore on, the hospital room that had been the center of their world for so long was slowly emptied. Ruby's personal belongings were packed away, machines were turned off and removed, and finally her body was taken to the mortuary. Yolanda found herself sitting alone in the now empty room, the events of the day washing over her. She looked around, remembering the countless hours she had spent here with Ruby, the laughter, the tears, the quiet conversations that had brought them closer than ever before. Once again, Yolanda seemed to break the fourth wall, addressing you directly. "Life is so fragile, so precious. Ruby taught me that in her final months. Don't wait for a tragedy to appreciate the people in your life. Tell them you love them. Show them you care. Because you never know when it might be your last chance." As she prepared to leave the room for the final time, Yolanda's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Diego. "Can we talk? I don't know how to process all of this." Yolanda replied quickly, agreeing to meet him. As she walked out of the hospital, she felt a mix of emotions: grief for Ruby's loss, anxiety about the responsibility she now faced, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, out of this tragedy, something positive could emerge. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, legal meetings, and emotional conversations. Yolanda found herself at the center of it all, trying to balance her own grief with the need to honor Ruby's wishes and help guide Diego through his pain. Emiliano remained distant, appearing only when necessary and speaking little. His anger seemed to have given way to a quiet resignation, but the rift between him and the others remained wide and deep. The day of the funeral dawned bright and clear, a beautiful autumn day that seemed at odds with the somber occasion. As Yolanda stood before the gathered mourners to deliver her eulogy, she felt Ruby's presence keenly. Ruby Martinez was many things to many people, Yolanda began, her voice strong despite her tears. A successful businesswoman, a loving mother, a loyal friend. But to me, she was a beacon of strength, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. As Yolanda spoke, she could see the impact of her words on the faces before her. Diego, his young face etched with grief and regret. Emiliano, stoic but with a glimmer of something perhaps understanding in his eyes, and countless others whose lives Ruby had touched. Ruby's final gift to us was a lesson in the true meaning of family, of love, and of legacy, Yolanda continued. She showed us that it's never too late to right wrongs, to forge new bonds, to make a difference. As she concluded her eulogy, Yolanda once again seemed to look directly at you, the viewer. Ruby's story doesn't end here. It lives on in all of us who knew her, who loved her, and it can live on in you too. Let her life be a reminder to cherish every moment, to love deeply, and to always strive to be the best version of yourself. As the service ended and the mourners began to disperse, Yolanda found herself standing between Diego and Emiliano. The three of them, bound together by Ruby's final wishes, faced an uncertain future. But in that moment, as they stood together before Ruby's final resting place, there was a sense of possibility, a chance for healing, for growth, for honoring Ruby's memory in the way she would have wanted. The story of Ruby Martinez had ended, but the impact of her life and her death was only beginning to unfold. A week after Ruby's funeral, the Martinez family gathered in the somber office of Mr. Alvarez, Ruby's longtime lawyer. The tension in the room was palpable as Emiliano, Diego, and Yolanda sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting for the formal reading of Ruby's will. Mr. Alvarez cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the document before him. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I want to remind everyone that Mrs. Martinez was of sound mind when she made these decisions. Her wishes are legally binding and reflect her final desires for her estate." Emiliano shifted in his seat, a scowl etched on his face. Diego looked pale and anxious, while Yolanda sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "To my husband, Emiliano Martinez," Mr. Alvarez began reading, "I leave a sum of $500,000. This amount is intended to provide for your comfort, but not excess. It is my hope that you will use this time to reflect on the values that once defined our marriage." Emiliano's face flushed red, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. "To my son, Diego Martinez." The lawyer continued, "I establish a trust fund of $2 million for your education and future endeavors. However, this fund comes with conditions. You must complete your degree and demonstrate a commitment to community service before you can access the full amount. It is my wish that you use this opportunity to grow into the man I know you can be." Diego's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and confusion crossing his face. "The remainder of my estate, including my shares in Martinez Enterprises, I leave to my cousin Yolanda Reyes." A collective gasp filled the room. Emiliano jumped to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous. She can't do this." Mr. Alvarez remained calm, raising a hand to quiet Emiliano. "Mr. Martinez, please, there's more." As Emiliano reluctantly sat back down, the lawyer continued reading. "To Yolanda, I entrust not just my wealth, but the responsibility of carrying forward my legacy. I know that you will use these resources wisely and for the betterment of others." Yolanda sat in stunned silence, the weight of Ruby's decision settling heavily on her shoulders. Finally, Mr. Alvarez read, "I am establishing the Ruby Martinez Foundation. This foundation will focus on supporting women in business, funding cancer research, and providing assistance to families dealing with terminal illnesses. It is my hope that through this foundation, my life's work can continue to make a positive impact on the world." As the lawyer finished reading, the room fell into a heavy silence. Each person seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the implications of Ruby's final wishes. Emiliano was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "This is a mistake. Ruby wasn't thinking clearly. I'll contest this." Mr. Alvarez shook his head firmly. "Mr. Martinez, I assure you everything is in order. Mrs. Martinez was very clear about her wishes. Contesting the will would be both futile and against her explicit desires." Diego, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, his voice small and uncertain. "But why? Why did she do this?" Yolanda, still processing the enormous responsibility that had been placed on her, turned to Diego with compassion in her eyes. "Your mother wanted to ensure her legacy would continue, Diego. She wanted to make a difference even after she was gone." As the reality of the situation sank in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Emiliano stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Diego sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And Yolanda remained in her seat, overwhelmed by the trust Ruby had placed in her. As you watch this unfold, dear viewer, remember that life can take unexpected turns. The choices we make, the relationships we nurture or neglect, can have far-reaching consequences. Ruby's decision serves as a powerful reminder that our actions in life can echo long after we're gone. Just as the shock of Ruby's will began to settle, Mr. Alvarez cleared his throat once more. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a sealed envelope. "Mrs. Martinez left this letter to be read after the will. She was very specific about the timing." The tension in the room, which had momentarily dissipated, returned full force. Diego lifted his head, curiosity replacing grief in his eyes. Yolanda leaned forward, her heart racing with anticipation and a touch of fear. Even Emiliano, who had been about to leave, paused at the door, his hand on the knob. Mr. Alvarez carefully opened the envelope and began to read. "My dear family, if you're hearing this, then the details of my will have been revealed. I know my decisions may have come as a shock to you, perhaps even feeling like a betrayal. But there's more to this story than you know, and it's time for the whole truth to come to light." The lawyer paused, looking up at the faces before him. Emiliano had turned back, his expression a mix of anger and curiosity. Diego was sitting up straight, hanging on every word. Yolanda's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Emiliano," the letter continued, "our marriage was not what it seemed to the outside world. For years I turned a blind eye to your infidelities, hoping that our love and our family would be enough to bring you back. But even in my darkest hour, facing death, you chose to distance yourself. The money I've left you is not out of spite, but out of hope that without the cushion of my wealth, you might rediscover the man I once loved." Emiliano stumbled back as if physically struck, collapsing into a chair. Diego turned to his father, shock and disbelief written across his face. "Diego, my sweet boy, there's something you need to know. Emiliano is not your biological father." A collective gasp filled the room. Diego's face drained of color, his eyes darting between Emiliano and the letter in Mr. Alvarez's hands. "Before I married Emiliano, I was in love with another man. He was killed in an accident before we could be together, but he left me with the greatest gift, you. Emiliano knew this when we married and agreed to raise you as his own. I hope you can forgive me for keeping this from you. But I always intended to tell you when the time was right." Diego sat frozen, his world turned upside down by this revelation. Emiliano's face was a mask of shame and anger, years of secrets finally exposed. Yolanda, the letter went on, causing her to sit up straighter. You may be wondering why I've entrusted you with so much. The truth is, you're more than just my cousin, you're my half-sister. Yolanda's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Our father had an affair with your mother. I discovered this years ago, but kept it secret to protect our families. But now, as I face the end of my life, I realize that the truth, however painful, is better than a comfortable lie. You've shown me the true meaning of family these past months, and I can think of no one better to carry on my legacy. The room was silent save for the sound of muffled sobs. Mr. Alvarez paused, allowing a moment for this news to sink in before continuing. There's one final twist to this tale. The Ruby Martinez Foundation isn't just a charitable organization, it's also a test. Emiliano and Diego, should you choose to involve yourselves in the Foundation's work, to truly dedicate yourselves to helping others as I've outlined, you'll find that your inheritance grows. The more you give of yourselves, the more you'll receive. And Yolanda, your role is perhaps the most challenging. You'll oversee not just my business interests, but this foundation as well. Your task is to guide Emiliano and Diego, should they choose to participate, and to ensure that my legacy is one of positive change in the world. As Mr. Alvarez finished reading, the room fell into a stunned silence. The revelations contained in Ruby's final letter had shaken each of them to their core, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths and reevaluate everything they thought they knew. Emiliano was the first to move, standing up abruptly. Without a word, he strode out of the room, the door slamming behind him. Diego remained in his seat, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. Yolanda sat still, tears streaming down her face as she grappled with the news of her true relationship to Ruby. Mr. Alvarez carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Mrs. Martinez hoped that these revelations, while difficult, would ultimately lead to healing and growth, he said softly. She believed in the power of truth, even when it's painful. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room, Yolanda turned to face you, the viewer, her eyes glistening with tears. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? Just when you think you have it all figured out, everything can change in an instant. Ruby's story reminds us that it's never too late for the truth, never too late remains. Never too late to change the course of our lives and the lives of those around us. Diego, still reeling from the news about his parentage, looked up at Yolanda. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yolanda reached out and took his hand. We honor your mother's wishes, she said softly. We face these truths, however difficult they may be, and we try to become the people she believed we could be. As they sat there, uncle and nephew, now revealed to be cousins, the full impact of Ruby's final act began to sink in. She had not just left them an inheritance, but a challenge. A chance to redefine themselves, to heal old wounds, and to make a difference in the world. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be more confrontations, more painful truths to face. Emiliano's reaction to the revelations was still unknown, a potential storm brewing on the horizon. The responsibilities placed on Yolanda's shoulders were enormous, and Diego's world had been turned upside down. But as they left Mr. Alvarez's office that day, there was also a glimmer of hope. Ruby's final gift to them had been the truth, and with it, the opportunity for a new beginning. As you reflect on this unexpected turn of events, dear viewer, consider the secrets in your own life. Are there truths that need to be spoken? Relationships that need to be mended? Ruby's story teaches us that it's never too late for honesty, for forgiveness, for change. The question is, are we brave enough to embrace that chance when it comes? In the days following the reading of Ruby's will and her revealing letter, the Martinez family found themselves in emotional turmoil, each member grappling with their own conflicting feelings and reactions. Diego, still reeling from the discovery about his true parentage, isolated himself in his childhood bedroom. The space that once brought comfort now felt alien, filled with photos and mementos of a family life that suddenly seemed built on lies. He alternated between periods of numbing disbelief and intense anger. One afternoon, as he sat on his bed staring at a family portrait, Diego turned to you, the viewer, his eyes red-rimmed and voice hoarse. "How do you move forward when everything you thought you knew turns out to be false? I feel like I've lost both my parents in one fell swoop." His relationship with Emiliano, already strained, had now reached a breaking point. The man he had called father for 18 years was now a stranger, their shared history tainted by the revelation of Ruby's secret. Diego found himself analyzing every memory, every interaction, wondering how much had been genuine and how much had been an act. Emiliano, for his part, had retreated to a hotel, refusing to return to the family home. His emotions swung wildly between rage at Ruby for exposing his infidelities, shame for his behavior during her illness, and a deep-seated fear of losing Diego completely. In a moment of vulnerability, Emiliano looked directly at the camera, as if speaking to you personally. "I know I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But is this punishment fair? To have my whole life, my relationship with my son, torn apart?" His anger at Ruby's decision regarding the will had been overshadowed by the bigger revelations. The money, which had seemed so important before, now felt insignificant in the face of potentially losing his family. Emiliano found himself at a crossroads, torn between his pride and the desire to make amends. Yolanda, meanwhile, felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the responsibility Ruby had placed on her shoulders. The joy of discovering her true relationship with Ruby was tempered by the challenge of managing the estate and foundation, as well as the expectation that she would help guide Emiliano and Diego through this difficult time. Late one night, as she pored over documents related to Ruby's business empire, Yolanda paused and addressed you, the unseen audience. "Ruby always said I was stronger than I knew," she mused, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I guess now's the time to prove her right." She felt a mix of honor and trepidation at being chosen as Ruby's heir and the custodian of her legacy. The trust Ruby had placed in her was both a blessing and a burden. Yolanda was determined to live up to her sister's expectations, but the path forward was far from clear. The family's conflicting emotions came to a head one week after the will reading. Yolanda had called a family meeting at Ruby's house, hoping to begin the process of healing and moving forward. The atmosphere was tense as Diego and Emiliano entered the living room, carefully avoiding eye contact with each other. "I know we're all hurting," Yolanda began, her voice gentle but firm. "But Ruby wanted us to come together, to build something positive out of this pain." But Emiliano scoffed, his face a mask of bitterness. "Easy for you to say. You're the one who got everything." "I didn't ask for this," Yolanda retorted, a flash of anger in her eyes. "And if you think managing Ruby's empire while dealing with this family drama is some kind of prize, you're sorely mistaken." Diego, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Stop it, both of you," his voice cracked with emotion. "Mom's gone, and all you can think about is money and power? What about what she really wanted for us?" The room fell silent, the weight of Diego's words hanging in the air. For a moment it was as if Ruby's presence filled the room, reminding them of the greater purpose behind her final actions. Emiliano was the first to break the silence. "Diego," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I know I've let you down, let Ruby down, but you're my son regardless of biology. I want to try to make things right." Diego looked at Emiliano, years of hurt and recent betrayal warring with a lifetime of love. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said slowly, "but maybe we can try to start over." Yolanda watched this exchange, tears in her eyes. "This is what Ruby wanted," she said softly. "For us to face the truth and find a way forward together." As the three of them sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, the full complexity of their emotions was evident. There was pain, yes, and anger, but there was also a glimmer of hope. a tentative reaching out toward understanding and reconciliation. Emiliano, his face etched with regret, turned to the camera. "I've spent so long running from the truth," he confessed. "Maybe it's time I finally faced it." Diego nodded, adding his own reflection. "Mom always said that family was about more than blood. I guess now we get to prove if that's true." Yolanda, feeling the weight of her new role, addressed you, the viewer, directly. Ruby's last gift to us was the chance to redefine ourselves, to build something meaningful out of the ashes of our old lives. It won't be easy, but I think it's a challenge worth accepting. As the family tentatively began to discuss Ruby's foundation and the conditions of her will, there was a palpable shift in the room. The anger and shock of the initial revelations had not disappeared, but they were tempered now by a shared desire to honor Ruby's memory and perhaps to become the family she had always believed they could be. Their journey forward would not be smooth. There would be setbacks, arguments, and moments of doubt, but in choosing to face their conflicting emotions together, in choosing to try despite the pain and uncertainty, they were taking the first steps toward healing. And as you witness this pivotal moment, dear viewer, perhaps you'll find yourself reflecting on your own family dynamics, your own unspoken truths. Ruby's story reminds us that it's never too late to confront our past, to mend broken relationships, to strive for something better. The question is, are we brave enough to take that first, difficult step? 5 years had passed since Ruby's passing, and the world had moved on in many ways. Yet, for those closest to her, her influence continued to shape their lives in profound and unexpected ways. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day of Ruby's funeral, Yolanda stood before her sister's grave. The polished marble headstone gleamed in the early sunlight, Ruby's name etched in elegant script. Yolanda placed a bouquet of vibrant red roses, Ruby's favorite, at the base of the stone. "Oh, Ruby," Yolanda sighed, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "You wouldn't believe how things have changed." As if addressing you, the unseen viewer, Yolanda began to recount the journey of the past 5 years. It wasn't easy at first, she admitted. The weight of Ruby's legacy, the responsibility she placed on my shoulders, it was overwhelming. Indeed, the early days had been fraught with challenges. Yolanda had to quickly learn the intricacies of running Ruby's business empire while also managing the newly established Ruby Martinez Foundation. There were sleepless nights poring over financial reports, tense board meetings, and moments of self-doubt when she questioned whether she was truly up to the task. But Yolanda had persevered, drawing strength from the memory of her sister and the trust Ruby had placed in her. Slowly but surely she had grown into her role, bringing a fresh perspective to the business and infusing the foundation's work with genuine passion. "The foundation has done some amazing work," Ruby, Yolanda said, her voice filled with pride. "We've funded groundbreaking cancer research, supported hundreds of women entrepreneurs, and provided assistance to countless families dealing with terminal illnesses. Your vision is changing lives every day." As Yolanda spoke, her mind wandered to the transformation she had witnessed in Diego. Ruby's son, her nephew, she reminded herself, had struggled greatly in the aftermath of the revelations about his parentage. He had taken a leave of absence from his studies, grappling with questions of identity and belonging. But true to Ruby's hopes, Diego had found purpose in the foundation's work. Initially volunteering to fulfill the conditions of his trust fund, he had discovered a genuine passion for philanthropy. Now at 23, he was heading up the foundation's youth outreach program, using his own experiences to connect with and inspire young people facing adversity. "Diego's grown into an incredible young man," Ruby, Yolanda said softly. "He has your compassion, your drive to make a difference. You'd be so proud of him." The thought of Diego inevitably led to Emiliano. His journey had perhaps been the most tumultuous of all. The exposure of his infidelities and the truth about Diego's parentage had initially sent him into a spiral of anger and self-pity. He had threatened legal action, made scenes at board meetings, and seemed determined to tear apart everything Ruby had built. But as the months passed, something had shifted in Emiliano. Perhaps it was the realization that his actions were pushing Diego further away, or maybe it was the gradual understanding of the depth of Ruby's final message. Whatever the catalyst, Emiliano had begun to change. "You'll never guess what Emiliano's doing now," Yolanda said, a hint of amazement in her voice. "He's become one of the Foundation's most dedicated volunteers. He's using his business contacts to secure donations, and he's even started a mentorship program for young men, teaching them about integrity and responsibility in both personal and professional life." The irony wasn't lost on Yolanda. The man who had once been so focused on wealth and status was now finding fulfillment in giving back. It was as if Ruby's parting challenge had awakened something long dormant in Emiliano, a desire to be a better man, to leave a positive legacy of his own. As for Yolanda herself, the past 5 years had been a journey of self-discovery. Thrust into a world she had never imagined for herself, she had uncovered strengths and talents she didn't know she possessed. The shy, uncertain woman who had first stepped up to care for Ruby during her illness had blossomed into a confident, compassionate leader. "I wish you could see it," Ruby, Yolanda said, her voice thick with emotion. "The way your last act brought us all together, pushed us to be better versions of ourselves. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought it would all fall apart. But we did it. We're honoring your memory in the best way we know how." As Yolanda stood there, lost in reflection, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Diego and Emiliano walking towards her, each carrying their own bouquet of flowers. The sight of them together, united in their purpose to honor Ruby, brought a fresh wave of emotion. "Hey, Aunt Yolanda," Diego said softly, embracing her before placing his flowers at the grave. Emiliano nodded in greeting, his eyes misty, as he added his own tribute to the growing collection at the base of the headstone. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, each lost in their own memories of Ruby and reflections on the journey that had brought them to this point. It was Emiliano who finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "about what Ruby would say if she could see us now, if she could see how her last wishes have played out." Diego nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "She'd probably say I told you so in that way she had. You know, where you couldn't tell if she was annoyed or proud." Yolanda chuckled softly. She always did have a knack for being right, even when we didn't want to admit it. As they stood there, sharing memories and reflections, it was clear that Ruby's influence continued to shape their lives. The pain of loss and betrayal had not disappeared entirely, but it had been tempered by time and by the shared purpose Ruby had given them. Turning to face you, the viewer, Yolanda spoke with a quiet intensity. Ruby's story didn't end with her death. In many ways, it was just the beginning. She showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, to right wrongs, to become the people we're meant to be. Her legacy lives on in every life we touch through the Foundation. In every moment we choose love and forgiveness over bitterness and anger. But Diego, noticing Yolanda's distant gaze, added his own thoughts. "Mom always said that true wealth wasn't about money, but about the impact you have on others. I didn't really understand that until now, but looking at what we've built together, the lives we've changed, I get it. This is the real inheritance she left us." Emiliano, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "I wasted so many years chasing the wrong things," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But Ruby, even in death, she found a way to set me on the right path. I can never make up for my past mistakes, but I can honor her memory by being the man she always believed I could be." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the cemetery, the three of them prepared to leave. But before they did, Yolanda had one last message for you, the audience who had followed this journey from the beginning. "Ruby's story is more than just a tale of one family's struggles and reconciliation," she said, her eyes shining with conviction. It's a reminder that we all have the power to leave a lasting positive impact on the world. It's never too late to change, to forgive, to forgive. Ruby understood that, and she used her last act to teach us that lesson. With a final look at Ruby's grave, Yolanda, Diego, and Emiliano turned to leave, walking together towards the future Ruby had envisioned for them. As they went, there was a sense of hope, of purpose, of a legacy not just preserved but actively lived. And for you, dear viewer, perhaps Ruby's story has sparked something within you. A desire to mend fences, to make a difference, to leave your own positive mark on the world. Remember, it's never too late to start. As Ruby showed us, sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of an even more beautiful story. You know, there's a part of Ruby's letter we didn't share before. Her final words to us were, love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice we make every day. Choose love, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Ruby taught us that it's never too late to heal, to forgive, to become the person you've always wanted to be. She showed us that our legacy isn't built in grand gestures, but in the small choices we make every day. To you, watching this, I want you to know there's someone out there who needs to hear your voice today. Someone who's waiting for your forgiveness, your love, your presence. Don't wait until it's too late. Make that call. Write that letter. Say I love you while you still can. Life is fragile and time is precious. Don't let pride or fear keep you from the people you love. Because one day you might be standing where we are now, wishing you had one more moment, one more chance to say what's in your heart. Ruby's gone, but her love lives on in us, in the lives we touch, in the kindness we show to others. And your love? It can change someone's world today. So please don't wait. Choose love. Choose forgiveness. Choose to make a difference, no matter how small it might seem. Because in the end, it's not about the wealth we accumulate or the success we achieve. It's about the lives we touch, the love we share, and the legacy of kindness we leave behind. That's what truly lasts. That's what Ruby taught us, and that's what I hope you'll take from her story. As Yolanda's words faded, the gentle breeze carried the soft sound of sniffles and quiet sobs, a testament to the powerful truth of Ruby's final lesson, a lesson that transcends the screen and touches the very core of what it means to be human. You know, Ruby always believed in the power of sharing stories. She used to say our experiences can be a light for others, guiding them through their own dark times. If Ruby's journey has touched your heart the way it's touched ours, we'd be honored if you'd join us in keeping her spirit alive. By hitting that like button, subscribing, and turning on notifications, you'll be part of a community that celebrates love, forgiveness, and the courage to change. Every story we share is a new adventure, and we truly love taking these journeys with you. Your thoughts matter to us, they're like echoes of Ruby's wisdom. So please, let us know in the comments how this story made you feel, and what kind of tales you'd like to hear next. Remember, we're here to bring you these heartwarming stories, just as Ruby would have wanted. Because in sharing our experiences, we grow, we heal, and we inspire each other to be better. Thank you for being part of Ruby's legacy. Until next time, keep choosing love.